So GDPR, boring name, big consequences. The thing I want to impart with you today, or there's four actually, is what the GDPR is, why it exists, the key things to know about it, and how to assess risk in your organization, and some of the best practices and tools that I've found to help bring you into compliance. First off, a little bit about us. StrategyBox is an analytics platform for marketing, sales, and operations. I'm the founder of it, and basically we put all your data in one spot, and we give super simple dashboards and reports that get you answers so you can take action on it. And what our work is a lot of the time is figuring out a lot of different data sources and how they talk to each other. And we do this for companies like Fetzer Vineyards, which is the largest, I believe the largest organic winery in the world, to companies like tourism companies like West Coast Sightseeing, all the way to super complex software as a service companies like Precision Nutrition. And what I've noticed and observed, because we typically start with a data strategy and how data is handled in these companies, is nobody's got a very good handle and there's a lot of vulnerability. And when you think about strong regulation like the GDPR, that could have a really negative effect on the business. And so that's why I put stuff like this together, because I want businesses to be warned that there's a really big risk here. I do want to say up front, we're not lawyers. None of the recommendations that I will make today or what I'm going to talk about today is hard and fast, and it should be delivered to your legal team and your in-house counsel or your outside lawyer for review. But we can make some really clear operational recommendations for you, and obviously then those can be vetted through your team. So I want to say that up top. So the GDPR. We've got a lot of different people here today. We've got retailers, blockchain, people in the blockchain space, digital agencies, both design and people designing and building apps. And so I'm going to give enough examples throughout this that I think they can apply to each of those areas. But obviously, if you have specific questions, we're going to have time for that at the end. So onto the GDPR. I want to take you guys back. The year is 1995. The phones were colorful, but didn't have color screens. Windows 95 was all the rage, and you wore Junko jeans and you accessed the internet via a 28.8 modem, and you stopped accessing the internet when your mom or your sister wanted to use the phone. So 1995 is the first year that internet privacy regulations were written, and they honestly haven't been revamped that much in the preceding years. So when you think about how data is handled, people couldn't really share large amounts of data in 1995. And if you wanted to, you had to physically send a hard drive somewhere. So the laws are now in 2018 just starting to catch up and into how data is shared. And when we think about how data is shared today, it's a lot of different sources. You can run an entire business on a phone. And when you think about the back end of that, you've got customer databases talking to marketing automation software, which is talking to Instagram and talking to Facebook, and you're mixing that all together. And those links, A, can be weak, and B, customer data can end up in a lot of different places and not necessarily ones you intended to. So the GDPR helps kind of rein that in, or at least make companies aware of it and make their customers aware of it. Now, it's a pretty big law. I think it's made for some very, very entertaining bedtime reading, let me tell you, over the past couple months. The key things you need to know about it, it stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's possibly the most boringly named law ever. It comes into effect May 25th, 2018, so literally 34 days away. And it affects any company that deals with European Economic Area citizens. So that's Europe proper, that's Eastern Europe, that's the UK. And I think this is the kicker that not a lot of companies realize. Even if you're domiciled in North America or in Asia, but you have European customers, you fall under these regulations. And that's really important for people to know. And the general rule I've been giving companies is you're at greater risk if you have European customers and have offices in Europe or interests in Europe than not. If you kind of are headquartered here, but have European customers, there's no clear laws yet to say, oh, if you were to be fined, let's say, how that fine would be kind of taken out. That's not to say there's not a risk, but that's just the rules at the moment. So those are the key things to know about the GDPR. I have to say, after reading it and reading a lot of the resources and talking to some of the people involved, there is a genuine want for companies and people and customers to work together to be compliant. This isn't like the big baddies are out to get you and seize all your cash. The idea here is generally that, like, oh, the technology has changed. People should be informed as to how their data is collected and what their data is going to be used for. And then they have the right to take it back, or they have the right for it to be forgotten in a reasonable amount of time. And that's pretty big. The biggest thing about the GDPR that I kind of scare people with is there's big fines. And I'm going to explain why that's important in a second, but the fines it's 4% of your global revenue, or 20 million euro, whichever is bigger. So there's real consequences if you're kind of caught not sharing data properly, or you've mishandled your data. And unfortunately, we're living in an era now where companies, there's more data breaches that are happening, and it's a tough regulatory environment. And I'm going to talk about the complications of that in a second. But one of the big things that's a big change for the GDPR practically for companies is that customers have the right to consent, have to consent to being to have their data collected. So all your contracts, all your terms and conditions on your site, your online store, it has to state up top. It can't be buried in section like 47A of a contract what you're doing with their data. So practically, that means things like a customer email sign up is probably going to have 1 or 2 lines about it to say, hey, we collect your data, it gets stored in a database, we use it for Facebook retargeting. So advertisements that you would see on other social sites, you're going to see from us, and that's because we collect your data now. Email, another practical thing is email signups can no longer be auto-ticked. So, you know, when you go, hey, sign up for your e-newsletter, that has to be that tick box has to be left blank. And if this is for agencies, if you're buying lists of data, or you share data, or you have, let's say, a data management platform, you have to, and you're, let's say, buying audience data, you have to ensure that that data has been verified, because you're responsible for it. And one only has to look to kind of Cambridge Analytica for like the really bad negative example of that. You can no longer just say, I didn't know where it came from, and that's it, and kind of wash your hands of it. The other big thing about the GDPR is you have the right to be forgotten, and this is a big change. And it just means that you can't keep a customer's data indefinitely. You can't have some spreadsheet sitting on a hard drive of 10,000 email addresses from that old campaign you did 4 years ago. There is no hard and fast rule to say how long you can or can't keep data. What the GDPR recommends and what we recommend is it's how long it's reasonable. So if your typical sales cycle is, let's say, 2 to 3 months, you can only really keep and that person doesn't become a customer in those 2 to 3 months. You probably only have about a year to a year and a half of keeping that data before you have to get rid of it. So that means you need to create a process for automatically cleaning up your email, your Facebook audiences, and your customer lists, and doing it periodically. And we're going to talk about how to kind of implement that within your organization in a bit. So I often, when I first started learning about the GDPR and I kind of brought it to some of our customers, they kind of just looked at me and went like, okay, whatever, Aaron, like, can we just wait until something goes wrong? And I kind of touched on this earlier with the bigger fines. No, you can't. This is a tough regulatory environment. More frequent data breaches are happening. And the more security people I talk to, the more I see in the news, it's becoming a course of doing business that a data breach will happen. There's too many pieces of, or too many kind of data sources that talk to each other that leave you vulnerable. Some of it has nothing to do with you. You just run you're a retail company and you run MailChimp and have an email list and you use Facebook ads and an e-commerce platform, there's weaknesses with all of that. And you are legally held responsible for it. So it's not kind of a question of when something will go wrong. It's not if something will go wrong, it's when something will go wrong. So what do you do? Well, or I think you start with assessing how big of a risk, financial risk, you're actually taking with your data. So the US, data breaches are becoming a hell of a lot more frequent, and they're costing people a lot of money. In the UK, it's $3.1 million, and this is in 2017. In the US, it's a lot more. I'll try to stay away from US examples. But there's a big price tag attached to having a data breach. And this is not just fines. This is, oh, you lose revenue. And I think kind of one of the best examples of that is Equifax. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but they're a credit reporter in the States. They leaked financial info of 143 million people. They lost, in a matter of months, $3 billion in revenue. And it was all because somebody didn't update a server. So that's the kind of weaknesses you're dealing with today. And the GDPR kind of helps companies proactively address that so it doesn't happen in the future. So I just say to companies in general, protect your neck. There's really simple steps that you can take to ensure you remain in compliance and that you have less of a chance of having a data breach. And I want to give you some of those today. So the GDPR is a really long document, but at the end of the day, what you want to be doing is saying, hey, you need to know who owns data privacy in your organization and assess that risk. You need to ID the policies you need to change and the processes. And I think if there is nothing else that you do besides, you take away nothing else from this webinar, it's that you have an emergency preparedness plan for when a data breach happens. The biggest thing is when a company gets caught flat-footed, when a data breach happens, people get pissed off, the media gets involved. If you can show that you were proactive, it makes everything so much easier. And it doesn't take a lot of work to do that. And I'm going to show you the specific steps a little bit later to take, to put an emergency preparedness plan in place. So first step is know who owns data privacy. So put someone in charge of assessing risk in your organization and running a project. My recommendation is this is a senior leader and it's not somebody who's a lawyer. Or it's not your in-house counsel, and I'm going to explain why in a second. If you're a company of over 250 employees, generally it's kind of the rough guideline, is you're required to have a separate data privacy officer. So this is an employee whose title is data privacy officer. If you're below 250 employees, you just need somebody that's part of their task. So that could be somebody in operations, somebody in marketing. And the reason why I say that is there's a lot of systems that need practical changes. There's also training that needs to happen. And that's typically not a lawyer's strength. It's not really their job. So that's why I say, hey, assign somebody in operations, assign somebody in marketing, because they know these things well and they know the practical implications, not so much changing the language and terms and conditions, which is what we're going to cover in a second. So one of the big questions I get is how to assess risk. So, okay, we know we're going to look after this privacy thing. How do we assess how bad we are? Like, is this super important, or is this something that we can implement over the coming months? Generally, I say if you're just kind of a real estate office, you're collecting email addresses, you do a little bit of online marketing, your risk is pretty low. This is something you need to do, but you're going to be okay. If you sell online, you use marketing tools like HubSpot, using audiences in Facebook and MailChimp, your risk is actually pretty high. And I don't care if you're a $15 million a year company or a $500 million a year company. Those tools and inherently what you do makes you a ripe target for both GDPR and for data breaches. So your risk kind of goes a lot higher. If you store a lot of data, that makes somebody identifiable. So if you have an app business and you collect a lot of information about your users, specifically when the GDPR makes provisions for what is identifiable, unfortunately, it's pretty black and white. So I am 6'2". I live in Vancouver. I run a marketing analytics company. and you store that information in your app, but not my name, that's still, well, you know what? There's only 2 guys that fit that description. One of them's Aaron Vidas. Yeah, that's identifiable information. Falls under the GDPR. So that, again, puts your risk into a really high category. If you're an agency and you share or sell data to others, your risk is really high, because most likely you have big lists of information that are all pooled together from different sources, and people have probably not given their explicit consent that's GDPR compliant to use that data for targeting audiences, sharing audiences, or selling. So that makes your risk really high for being in breach or being in violation. So what I say, once you kind of know your risk and know how much of a priority this is put a number to it. So a tool I found online that I really like, I actually really like the company too, is called the breach level index. You can literally just Google breach level index, and you can put in the number of records you keep, the type of data, and actually gives you a really good scale. And then it also can put a value to it. So typical data breaches, it's kind of, they do it by per record. So you could say, oh, you have 500,000 customers in the database. A data breach for the type of data that you store is $50 a record. So just 500,000 multiplied by 50. There's your financial risk, plus fines. So that's the general rule. The second thing that you want to do once you've kind of you've assigned a person, assessed your risk, is gather all those policies that you need to change. So put all your privacy forms, all your consent forms, take little screenshots of when a new customer signs up on your app, what's the screens that they're greeted with when they're giving personal information. If you're a SaaS company, get all your contracts in one place, get all your website terms and conditions and privacy policies just in one folder. I think that's often half the battle, is you don't understand what you have. The other thing is, how do my customers give consent to having their data collected and shared? So once you have all that data, you can start seeing, oh, hey, how are we letting our customers give consent about and being informed about how we're using their data? There's checklists out there. There's paid, there's unpaid versions, but I find it's easiest to get a GDPR checklist that just says, hey, this is what you need to give for explicit consent, or in what stage, and here's what good privacy policies look like. Then you just put another list together. Okay, what do I got to change? Terms and conditions, contract. Okay, it's your standard change management process. The other thing you need to do is identify the processes that you need to change. So this is where somebody who's more in operations and marketing, who's leading the project, can get into the kind of the nitty-gritty. So I start by mapping out how you collect data. Just get a big piece of paper out and say, hey, these are all our data sources. This is where that data is stored, and this is how that data is used. And you do a flow chart, essentially. And then you have to assess at each stage, okay, what customer data is stored and for how long, and what systems do we use to collect and store that data, and what are their vulnerabilities? If something's, let's say, not password protected, like you have a customer database, or you might have multiple customer databases in, let's say, AWS, and none of them have a password behind them. That's a vulnerability. Again, there's great checklists out there, some free, some paid. You're just identifying, okay, what the problems are, putting an action list together. Okay, who's going to do what to change those? Then standard change process, put all those changes into a plan and put a timeline around it. Now, the last step in all this is, again, I'm harping on data breaches and hacking for a reason, is because they're really frequent. 2017, 63% of data breaches happened because of hacking or unintended disclosure. And unintended disclosure means something like I mistakenly copied a marketing email database to the wrong spot and into a Facebook audience I shouldn't have, and that data, that database wasn't consented to properly. Suddenly your company is in really hot water because of kind of an innocent mistake. And that's why training, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is really important for marketing and operations employees. They need to understand what these regulations are and what how their day-to-day process is going to change in order to remain compliant. And that's kind of the consequences. If you're not compliant, Facebook lost $100 billion in market capitalization since the start of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now, none of us, I think, are dealing at that level, but there's real risk to a company if data is not handled well in 2018. And so that's why I say to people, this is why it's so important. Just have a plan. If you do nothing else out of this webinar, have a plan for when a data breach happens. The GDPR just says, listen, know what data you collect, put it in one doc, know what data your customers consent to and what you share and how long you keep it. It's a 2-page Word document. Also identify your supervisory authority. It's available on the GDPR website. If you work on any sort of audit, they'll also be able to identify who that is. And I think this is the most important part. You have to notify them within 72 hours of a breach. It looks really, really bad for you, even if you're innocent, if you wait a couple of weeks. The other thing too is there's specific guidelines in the GDPR if you do have a breach when you have to notify customers. It doesn't give an exact time frame. It says what's reasonable. We recommend within 3 to 7 days. As the law and more breaches happen, there'll be more definitive guidelines for your industry or your application. But at this time, I kind of recommend 3 to 7 days. So that's kind of it. The keys are really know who owns your data know who owns the data privacy function in your organization. Really put a number to that risk that you have. Like use the tools I talked about and say, okay, well, look, if something actually does happen, what is this a risk to our business? And is it, is it worth the, tens of thousands, the 10, 20 grand we're going to spend in order to get into compliance? ID the policies that you need to change, ID the processes that you need to change, and just put an action plan around it. And again, have an emergency preparedness plan for when a data breach happens. Because when it happens, you can just look to that and it's going to make life so much easier. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools. There's a company called TrustArc. They run the Trustee program, which you probably have seen. Once you see the logo, you kind of recognize it on websites. They do GDPR assessments. They're actually really good. I quite like them. The International Association of Privacy Professionals, IAP, does training in Europe and has online training for North America and for Asia. If you need specific training for, hey, a marketing team or an operations team needs to know more about X. Also in self-interest, we do audits and checklists. So we have an audit that examines your site, your databases, and your platforms, and it gives suggested changes for policies and processes. We give sample terms and conditions that are compliant, instances. We point out the instances where you need to, hey, customer, we're going to use your data this and this and this way when you buy a product from us. So you'll be remarketed to you through Facebook and through Google Display, for instance. We also just sell a checklist. So it's the actual internal checklist we use to evaluate companies. If you have the resources already and it's just kind of something you want to do, you feel you can take on your own, we're happy to give that checklist. So if you want any more information about it, I'll give my email address at the end of this presentation. But really, one thing I really want to point out is the GDPR makes it very explicit that there's no GDPR certification. There's no stamp of approval that you can have to say, hey, we as a company are GDPR compliant. And there's actually, it's very explicitly said. TrustArc seems to have, seems to promise that, and I'm kind of questioning why. So that's one thing I want you to be out for. If a consultant comes to you, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I can give you a certificate that says you're GDPR compliant, you can't be, because there is no such thing yet. So yeah, that's it. Customers have to know how you're using their data and give their consent to how you use it. It's not going to be when you have a data, it's not going to be if you have a data breach, but when. So you got to be protect your neck, be prepared. and really attach a financial risk and consider an audit. There's a lot of free checklists out there. Use a paid service. The projects don't take that long, and it could really, it ensures that in a year from now, 2 years from now, if something does go bad, you're not going to be in the nightly news in a way that you don't want to be. So other than that, I know that's a lot of information to hit you guys with. I want you guys to do the right thing. I want to answer your questions. If you have any questions about the audit or the checklist, feel free to email me, aaron@strategybox.com. But I want to turn it over to you guys right now and see what questions you have about GDPR. And it's already lighting up. I love it. So Jeremy asked, can you go over the financial implications? Jeremy, if you got asked maybe a little more specific of what are the financial implications of if you're caught or if a data breach happens? What are the penalties? Yeah, so very interestingly, the penalties for being in violation of GDPR are if you are found to mishandle data, for instance. I'm just talking about not a data breach, just mishandling it. Can be up to 4% of revenue globally for your company, or 20 million euro, whatever is bigger. So not insignificant. Now, I'm also getting a question about what retail companies can do, or what retail companies should be looking for specifically. The two big things I can say are ensure that you're very explicit in your customer sign-up process about what you're going to use their information for. So your mailing address, obviously you need that to be able to deliver a good. You're going to use their email address and personally identifiable information in most likely remarketing. And the other big thing is you need to make sure your data is cleaned up. You have the right to be forgotten under GDPR. So I encounter this all the time with retail companies. They've got a customer list that's like 4 years old. It's sitting on MailChimp. It's got 5,000, 10,000, 12,000 people. Oh yeah, we don't really use that anymore. You need to delete it because that holding on to that data puts you in violation of GDPR. Just somebody's typing. Jeremy, what if our business is a platform that enables other companies to market and collect data, like a Kickstarter? You provide a platform for other companies to raise funds, for instance. So what are the risks inherent in that? Jeremy, your company is in a really high risk category because you're taking in information and then sharing it amongst people. So you are what's known as you're both a data controller and you're a third party. You're also a third party, or I think it's called truncator in their language. So you have to be very aware or very explicit about, hey, this is the data we collect. This is what data is stored where. So maybe financial information is stored in a different area than remarketing information or area used for marketing, and only certain people can access it. The other thing too is that you're in a high risk category because you both own data and you have to get permission from organizations like partner organizations that you work with to be able to share that, and that needs to be reflected all the way back into your terms and conditions. So when somebody gives money on your platform, they need to know, oh, hey, the party that our platform is going to give money to is also going to get your data. Does that make sense? Awesome. Another question I'm getting from blockchain is one of the big questions I got this via email was, what do you do around financial information? Is there anything special you have to do with financial information? Yes, there's actually a ton of regulations, both within GDPR and separate legislation, both in North America and Europe, to handling of financial information. The thing that I've noticed is most platforms that deal with money and financial information, because they get attacked so often, their security consent forms how they grant data, how they ask for data are generally really good. So if you're looking for inspiration or you need kind of, oh, what's the terms and conditions look like, go to a company like PayPal, go to a company like Amazon Web Services, and look at look at the language that they use in their privacy and terms and conditions in their contracts, because that will be reflective of that's kind of the best analog for you. I think that's about it. Anybody else have any questions? Awesome. That looks about it. Well, guys, I want to thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions around this, if you want to have your questions around audits or checklists, feel free to email me, aaron@strategybox.com. I think this is a really important, GDPR is really important and something that a lot of companies don't realize they need to be compliant with. And thanks so much for your time. Have a great day.